Greetings. Let me welcome you to our conversations on COVID and development here at the Center for Global Development. And today it's a real privilege and a pleasure for me to welcome Philippe Le Houérou, who is the CEO of the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. And I should say, in the interest of full disclosure, that Philippe and I have known each other for a long time, and we have been colleagues in earlier incarnations, working together in the World Bank. And now Philippe has the responsibility of trying to craft what should be a response to the impact of the current pandemic and also of the economic consequences that follow from this pandemic on the private sector in developing countries. So I thought perhaps, Philippe, welcome. And I thought what we might start with really is a bit your appreciation of what you're hearing from your clients in developing countries, from the staff that you have in 150 plus developing countries, on what they are seeing in terms of the impact on the private sector. How is it unfolding? And what are the challenges that the private sector entrepreneurs are facing there?
Well, thank you very much, Masood, for giving me this opportunity to share with you what we're trying to do, what we see, and what we're trying to do. On your question, I just completed the tour of all of our country offices virtually, with all of my management team in all of the regions. The picture is, at the same time, there's a consistent story, and then there's a variation, which you can find also in the macro projection, and it's reflected at the micro level. So things are different in China today than they are in the Fiji. In the Fiji, I mean, it's all about tourism that basically disappeared. And on top of that, they're hit by a hurricane. So that's a situation very different from what you have in China, completely different. Then you have a situation like Haiti that started with huge vulnerabilities before the crisis. And now there is a huge plummet of the decrease of the remittances. So double hit. You have Nigeria that also started with vulnerabilities. And then you have the big hit on the price of oil. Then you have Kenya, where you have not only the coronavirus crisis, but then you have the locust in East Africa that is devastating a lot of crops. So that is mirrored in what we hear from our clients. What we have, and by the way, what is interesting is our clients and our non-clients. So we see now companies that before could manage without IFC, coming back, and the story is around the world. So they want now financing because there's a huge liquidity crush everywhere. And then we see on the, and then you can also have different stories for different type of companies. The most worrisome for us, and it's intuitive, but we see it, is what's going on the microfinance. And that's where you have the tens and tens and tens of millions of, small, mostly informal, but sometimes very small formal companies. The little bicycle garage. And we see there that there's a huge stress. In 2 months, for example, I don't want to name the countries, but we saw in 2 months, one of the microfinance institutions in where we invested, that saw the repayment rate drop from 95% to 50% in 2 months. So the problem is
their business model is based on having near perfect repayment rates.
Exactly. So that is something that we are very worried. We're also worried about the SMEs, where it's again access to liquidity to get some working capital when your revenue goes down. Most of the time there's a few employees. So for us, it's these are the two immediate. And then how will that translate into what we can do, but also what the government can do? I think that, like we see in this country, in the US or Europe. It's the same thing. Unemployment shoots up. What do you do? And we had a shift inside the World Bank Group, as you know very well, for a very long time. We were always recommending to protect livelihood instead of protecting jobs, to make sure that resources are allocated better, that productivity is maximized, etc. Now we are shifted for the crisis to say protect jobs. Why? Because the cost would be tremendous. If you lose a job, you lose a lot of knowledge, you lose a lot of organizational capacity, and which means when the crisis at one point will have to fade away, then you will not be ready to bounce back. And that's the way we like to think about the crisis, kind of phase one, phase two. We know there's overlap. It's more stylized, but I think that intellectually it helps follow and frame the issue. Phase one is obvious, and it's like everywhere else. It's how do you soften the blow? How do you soften the blow to minimize the destruction of markets and companies? Because the more you destroy, the harder phase two, which is reconstructing, recreating markets. We're into destruction of market than recreation before again going to recreating markets. So soften the blow is what we came up with this facility, but beyond the facility, and maybe even more important than what we're doing, is we're engaging with our colleagues in the bank, and I have later on a conversation with the IMF today, and the governments. We have phone calls from prime ministers. Everybody realizes what I'm saying. It's pretty straightforward. Now, the key question is what to do and how to do it. And then you have to tailor to the country capacity. If you have fiscal space, no fiscal space, how much, what is the most effective, and how to do it. So this is a very important stream of work that we're doing with our colleagues in the World Bank, because in every crisis, I think the role of the public sector will be heightened.
Well, I think you might even argue that one of the consequences of this crisis will be a rebalancing of the role of the public sector in many countries. The public sector will have to step in and do things that didn't need to do, and then the question becomes how they continue with that thereafter. So I think the public sector will certainly have that role going forward. So maybe this is actually a kind of good segue in a way to talk a bit about what CIFC is doing. So you've announced this 8 billion package. The World Bank has come up with an ambitious package of 160 billion over time, and IFC, of course, has a big role in that. And there's a lot of interest. We've received 2 or 3 or 4 questions about sort of what is the focus of this package? What will be the balance between existing clients and new ones? What are the criteria that people have for qualifying? And also sort of some questions about how can people get more information about it? Because I think the World Bank now has a dedicated web page where they're talking about all the investments and projects they're doing under COVID. I don't think IFC has one yet that has similar information, and it would be good to get a sense from you sort of what the content is and how you can make that more easily available to people.
Well, on that one, let's start on the narrow one on what we're trying to do. So what we try to help avoid is a liquidity crisis that translates into a solvency crisis.
Right.
So that's the first premise. Then is, okay, what can we do? Because contrary to the World Bank, as you know, we don't get government guarantees. We don't lend to government, we lend to the private sector.
Yes.
And then we need, contrary to what you do in the World Bank, we have to do a lot of due diligence when we start to work with a client, making sure that it's legit. We have to analyze the risk very differently from the bank. So the first thing is, if you want to be fast, work with existing clients. Why? Because we have already done the due diligence. We know who they are. We know where they stand in, and you were part of this discussion, in environment and social standards. that are very important to many. So the easy was to say, well, the existing clients means fast, because we don't need to do all this due diligence that can take weeks and months. So if you want to be fast, the obvious was existing client. That's number one. Second is what is needed the most right now is liquidity, working capital, and trade finance. So the 8 billion, which is part of the 14 billion package, but the bank decided that their part of the package will be targeted to procuring medical equipment for the emerging markets and developing economies. We decided we'll focus on working capital, access to working capital to finance, and mostly short-term and local currency. So the 8, you can break it down intellectually in 2 groups. One is to work through the banks, and that's the 6 of the 8 million. And that's made of liquidities and working capital finance for SMEs and trade finance. So trade finance of the 6 is 4 and 2 for the working capital finance. So that is through the banks that we know very well. We work with 800 key banks in all of emerging markets. So that's what we do. And then we have a 2 billion window to help our clients in the real sector that are also facing liquidity. But these are typically larger companies.
Yeah.
So where we stand today, so we asked and to be fast again, that's the second aspect, we asked the board to have delegated authority, which means we don't have to go to the board for every operation because you add another month of processing. So we can save that. So what we see, and we ask for a 2-year facility. In fact, in a month, we have already more demand than the 8 billion. We are at 10.2 billion. So that we're processing as quickly as we can. And one of the conditions, obviously, it has to have a link with the coronavirus. In other words, if you had problems before that have nothing to do with the coronavirus, you don't qualify. So that's the kind of criteria. So we have a very quick screening. We call that early look, and make a decision very quickly. And we try to, on the pricing, because we don't want to take advantage of the lack of liquidity to price completely at market. If you don't price at markets, you don't want also to land for someone that will turn around and make some money by placing this money. So we have to screen to make sure that we don't have a case of oops afterwards. So, but it has gone again 2 years. I mean, imagine we asked for 2 years. So we underestimated the demand, and after 4 weeks, we are already at 10.2 billion. So we have this triage, and we also try not to have the first come, first serve to make sure that IDA countries have also their fair share.
Right.
So it's a lot of change of the way we process things. It's faster, but it is faster because it is mostly with existing clients. Now, the second part of the question is, how about non-clients? And there we see a huge pickup of non-clients because in some country, all of a sudden, we became much more important than we were. I mean, as you know, in 2 months, you have 96 or $100 billion of portfolio investment outflows, and FDI is going down. Right. So what we see is, and that's also what we witness, FDI has not disappeared. We still have, the pipeline is still being delivered, but it has been reduced. A lot of the investors, and that's intuitive, but we see it in our work, are delaying the investments, not yet canceling, but mostly delaying. So our target for this year will deliver most of it, but not all of it because of these delays. But that has been compensated by these kind of short-term, especially working capital finance, which is really the key. And for the new clients, there are 2 types of new clients. There are new old clients, in other words, clients
coming
that
back
used to
to
work for IFC and then went and had their own way to do the finance that are coming back. Those are easier because we know them. And there's a new clients, and that is we will obviously do whatever we can to help, but we have to do the whole due diligence. Remember, and you know very well, we have not only to look at the credit risk, but also the environment, social, and governance aspect, which typically take some time. And then we have something that we call the integrity due diligence. When you don't know someone, you have to do you investigate who is in the capital, etc., etc. So that we see an uptick of this demand, but it will take more time than the 8 billion facility. So that's where we are. But we see a very big demand coming through. And then in parallel, and to your point on the public sector, we get more and more calls from governments. I had the Prime Minister calling me here. I mean, we know each other, but they know they have to do something. So yes, there would be de facto nationalization. Maybe that's not the correct word of the economy. The problem is you don't want that to be permanent.
yes.
You want to have the government to step in to stabilize, but at the same time, depending on how you do that, you can then go back and reprivatize. So that's what we are working on
And
with
I guess that's,
inside IFC.
I was going to say that must be particularly true for some of the big strategically important companies. If you look at Africa, for example, there are, 4 or 5 airlines that essentially serve a lot of Africa that come from and depend on the African market for their survival. And of course, they're all, like every airline right now, losing money hand over fist, right? And the question then becomes, these are not necessarily the kinds of companies that IFC would have been investing in, or necessarily the kinds of companies we would have been advising governments to go in and come in and rescue, because of course many of them, it took a lot of years to get them out of being state managed and less efficient. And yet if they don't survive this period, rebuilding that network will become impossible. So, I mean, that's the kind of dilemma that I guess you must be faced with. And how do you kind of approach that?
In fact, it's happening already. We have been asked with the World Bank to advise on the restructuring of some of these companies, and we started just starting the work. But I don't think that in the short term the solution can be private sector. I mean, you have to be viable, and by definition here you say you're not viable. So that's a very good example of what I'm trying to say. But that's true also for the microfinance, for micro institution.
Yeah.
The private sector is not going to step into a losing proposition to lose even more money. So that is where we need to craft what is the government intervention, because you can intervene in many different ways and some are more harmful than others. And that's what we're trying to tell the government. So we have kind of specific advisory. Our advisory, by the way, is being taxed to the limit now. We can see a huge uptick on the stress testing because a lot of companies and sometimes bigs don't have, how can I say, the know-how to do stress testing. So we help them. In my view, the restructuring part, we're organizing ourselves. We have a lot of experience in restructuring. We have a whole unit, for example, in IFC that deals with NPLs and bad loans, etc. So, and most of it means restructuring de facto. So we have this experience with trying to bolster this unit to help directly the large companies, because you're right, large companies have a huge structuring impact on economies, including for microfinance and the SMEs. I mean, if all the large companies disappear. So we have another working group exactly on that, which is, so we have a working group on the finance, from SME finance to banking and non-banks, but we have also a group that works on large companies, supply chains, and whole sectors. Because you talk about airlines, we also have a lot of investment in tourism that has virtually disappeared. And that's a big, as you know, labor intensive. We also are looking at the whole textile supply chain and how we can help. On the medical, we are thinking about new ways to help expand the capacity of some companies to build more masks, more equipment quickly. So there's a lot of things that we work also with the large company, but and the advisory. So airlines will be mostly advisory. So we need also to beef up our advisory and sometimes refocus it. So it may not be time to deploy for, big effort to do credit bureaus, but more on refocus on how can we help a company restructure and help government think through. How do you bail out the microfinance ecosystem in your country? What do you do? Because if you bail out, you may waste a lot of money bailing out even microfinance company that may not be viable, or SMEs. So we're trying to help the governments and our colleagues in the World Bank to be able to very quickly, because we see the demand. We have a lot of demands from government to say, okay, we know we want to limit the blow, as I said, kind of soften the blow. We have allocated X billions. How do we spend them?
Yeah, whereas X is a fraction of what is needed, because most of these countries, part of the problem is that unlike, where we're sitting in Washington or in Europe, where you can say, let's print the money and borrow it because we can spend what it takes, then spend what it takes is not really a very meaningful thing to say to many countries in Africa or in South Asia, because they're constrained on, they can neither print the money nor can they go out and borrow enough. So they have to make some really difficult choices. And I guess one of the things that, in a way, this also raises is that some of the things you soften the blow, as you say, and you hold them ready to kind of come back when the phase one is over and phase two start. Others, this is going to be a much longer lasting, deeper shadow from this crisis. So if you're doing, for example, tourism, I'm not personally convinced that tourism is going to come back in the same way for many, many years. Similarly, if we were talking about the Middle East yesterday, and if you look at the number of airlines in the Middle East, and you have to wonder whether that's a viable proposition anymore going forward. So making those choices under uncertainty, that country by country, must be a really difficult thing, but also a really high priority, because I think people talk about the medical health sector being overwhelmed by the crisis, and it is. You see it already in countries, although the crisis in many developing countries is still at an earlier phase. You already see the imbalance. But I think the other thing that's going to get overwhelmed is the capacity in governments to make strategic choices under great uncertainty, and anything you can do to help would be great. I don't know how you're thinking about that.
No, that's exactly spot on. That's exactly what we're doing, organizing ourselves to do, and to advise our country managers, country director on the ground that are on the receiving hands of these phone calls. So we give them as much kind of the thing that at least the way I think is the don't. Because there will be a lot of kind of knee-jerk reaction. Oh, we need to salvage the SMEs, for example. So we say, stop paying your electricity bill for everybody. So you can be a very rich person, all of a sudden you don't have to pay your electricity bill. Is that a good thing? No. Stop repaying the banks. That may be that's just kicking the can and making it a bigger problem down the road. So we're trying to see, and for example, I was talking to the African companies. They were telling me, you know what you can do to help right now, and it doesn't need any capacity, any nothing. Just ask the government to pay their arrears. That will be because in some country it's a lot.
Yes.
And sometimes it's more than meets that makes it in the budget, because you can have an arrear, you pay 10%, and depending on the regulation, it is called extinguished. It's only
Creative
10%.
accounting is not just limited to the private sector.
Oh no. It's there's a lot of creativity in the domain, but that would be an easy way to very quickly, and then you cannot say, you don't have to make the judgment of this will survive, this will not survive. This is a liability that you have. You get hopefully a suspension of debt. You get some break there. You get IMF program. You get some DPO from the bank. Use part of that to reduce your arrears as fast as you can and target the most vulnerable, where those that have the smallest margin in terms of access to liquidity. So that could be a very simple thing that we, and that's kind of the type of recommendation you cannot get wrong. Now, announcing Orbi and Torbi don't repay the banks may be a very bad way. So again, these are two extreme examples on what we're trying to put together for our country manager, a list of these, and then obviously you will have to tailor to the local conditions, and they vary dramatically from one country to the next. Even, I mean, I'm talking within region, let alone across the world. So that is what we're doing, and we're spending a lot of time and efforts. And by the way, one of the positive things, and you may appreciate that, that I've never seen so much cooperation between the colleagues from the World Bank and the IFC. You know that I've been preaching that for now a long time. Yes. And I guess that this crisis will be an accelerator, because the true solution will be public-private. Yes. I think that the nice world, which is theoretical, that the private sector on one hand and the public sector on the other hand, and these two very different animals, that now it's nakedly incorrect. So it naturally forces this cooperation, which I always thought could be one much better for the benefit of our client countries and the client companies.
And do you see also more coordination, cooperation with the other DFIs? Because you have a program, 8 billion. You're big in relation to many DFIs, but there are other people working. EBRDs there. I've the IDB Invest is there. So a lot of MDBs have their own private sector arm. Then there are the national DFIs that are quite big, the development banks. How is that process unfolding? Is there
MDB,
more willingness, more ability?
Yeah, there are much more cooperation, and starting at the head. I mean, I think in the last 3 weeks we had 3 or 4 virtual meetings with all the heads of the MDBs, and there will be one coming soon. And then on May 5, we are hosting, typically during the annual meeting, IFC hosts the DFI focus on the private sector. So we're going to do that on May 5th to make sure that we give the same kind of advice. And we waited until May 5th to make sure that we ourselves know what we are trying to do and what kind of advice and how we can pull other resources together. So we'll be not perfect, but better than we would have been a month ago. So on May 5th, we will talk to the DFIs, and we have the meeting that should have happened during the spring meeting will happen virtually. So we see more of that, and on the ground, which is also critical, I see more and more cooperation, which is good. I mean, crises are a good way to focus the mind and stop the little squabbling and me, you, and so I think that that's the good part of human nature, that the solidarity and increase when you are all confronted with a big external threat. And that
is bigger than the combined efforts are not going to add up to what is needed. Let's face it, but at least we can make sure they have a maximum impact, so that we don't end up tripping over each other or giving different advice. Because I have to say that what I worry about a bit myself is that if you're a developing country policymaker today, on almost every topic, what you're getting is multiple views and and uncertainty. Should you open schools or not open schools? Should you have a complete lockdown or not have a complete lockdown? Should you save your airline or not save your airline? And in some areas, that uncertainty just reflects the lack of evidence there is. I mean, that's the best we can do. But in other areas, I think at least we have to make sure that when we are talking to the same person and giving them advice on the same issue, we're at least aware of why different people amongst us are giving different advice. And that's where the coordination bit, as you say, will be most essential.
Well, that's where the famous country platform that we've been discussing in the best part of the last 2 years. I mean, if you want to be positive, we'll get a boost de facto. We started,
Yes.
to have more meetings, but it has to be country-based because the initial conditions are so widely different. So we can have the kind of general advice, mostly on the don'ts and basic no-brainer do's like arrears, if you can. But then that's kind of a good thing, but that's kind of skin deep. So you have to go much deeper. And that the coordination on the ground for me is irreplaceable. So that's not all DFIs have the capacity to be on the ground, or they're on the ground in some region but not in others. So that's why de facto the kind of the World Bank group. I mean, we have 105 offices, for example. The World Bank has even more. So we are present in many countries where some of the DFI are not present. So we can align on the way to do business, but then the government usually turns to those that are present. I mean, it's easier to pick up the phone and talk to someone because you both live in Addis Abeba than call all over the world on people that may not be aware of your conditions locally, and hence the advice may not be tailored to your what you can do or not do.
Okay, now maybe just a couple of specific points that we've received some questions on. Let me just raise those, and then I thought we might just move to this kind of larger topic in terms of what comes beyond the crisis in terms of the future of development finance and blended finance. But before that, one question that we got was, the IFC is quite involved in the health sector, but of course, in the health sector, in private health sectors, mostly in hospitals, and there's a question about whether the incentives for those private health facilities are to align themselves in a way right now to respond to the crisis in those countries, and the question really was whether how much and how effectively can you use your participation in the health sector to help them respond in what is a responsible way? And a sort of parallel questions raised about the sort of gender impact of this crisis. There's already emerging evidence that the impact on women, whether it's women workers who are more likely to be subject to domestic violence at home, or whether it's women in the supply chain, is greater. And again, you have all these now lines that you're putting in place with the banks for supporting SMEs. To what extent can you use your role and leverage, for want of a better word, to try and ensure that these issues, that the gender dimension is being factored into the appropriate response at the country level? And then the final specific question was the one I think I alluded to at the beginning, which was, how can IFC also make its actions more visible to people? Can you come up with some kind of website or some other mechanism for doing that? So those are three specific questions that we got this morning.
Okay, well, let's take them maybe in order. On the health side, I mean, we indeed invest in private hospitals, and more, by the way, on the digital side of that, kind of virtual pharmacies, stuff like that. I do believe that is something that will come out of the crisis even more. Is kind of the more kind of new business model, and basically a lot more on the digital side. What we're focusing today, obviously, so we basically called all of our clients. So we tailored our intervention to their need and their request, and sometimes we help them think through what are their needs, and that sometimes it's a real partnership. But what we focus now is on what can we do to help the bank procurement in some sense. So, the bank has put 6 billion to procure medical equipment. So that's kind of, you have here a solvable demand. Now, we can on the supply side, what we're trying to find is how can we increase the capacity of companies that are building medical equipment to respond to that, because as you know, there's a bit of a race now for maybe of the critical medical equipment. So we're trying to design a program around that, more on the supply side right now, and then catering to our clients on the hospital side. So on the health side, this is what we do, but at the same time, I mean, we are a very tiny player in the health sector. So what we do is pretty innovative, but it's not kind of the mainstay of the health sector. So that's on that. On the gender, to be honest, what I saw that was the most interesting is what you published. CGD just published, I think, an interesting piece on, and clearly it's based on previous crises, because these crises were in the middle of the fog. I mean, nothing has played out, but I think it was a very interesting way to look back and say, what are the lessons, what to watch for? So I think this was one very cogent piece of work and very useful. To be honest, yes, we use typically, and that's part of the S in the ESG, environment, social. A lot of our credit line are targeted at women entrepreneur. So obviously we're continuing that, and in all of our investment there's a gender dimension, and it can be nursery within the companies or stuff like that. But I think that the jury is still out. And what I saw, again, I mean, like your paper, I have to go back to the crisis I saw. But sometimes it's surprising results. When I remember the 2009 crisis, 2010 crisis in Eastern Europe, it was a financial crisis which has a big impact. And I remember a few countries, in fact, it was a reverse gender impact. Male were why? On the economic side, because males were typically in construction business or more on the private sector. Women were more on the public sector. So in terms of employment, those that suffered the most was the male, not the female. So it was a surprise. So the net impact, we don't know. On gender violence, we're worried. And but we don't have any data, to be honest.
Yes.
And to add to the gender, for me there's another dimension, but I don't have the answer. But it's the children.
Yes.
And that's not only access to education, but violence on children.
Yes, and that's where I'm also quite worried of the fact that keeping them out of school, particularly girls, but not only, keeping them out of school does probably expose them to greater risk of violence outside. So that's just something we have to factor in, into the equation.
And I was on the video conference this week with Save the Children. They're also very worried. So again, like you have done in CGD, they were kind of referring to previous crises to give a sense of the pointers of where will be the difficulties to get prepared to do something about it. Yeah. So that was basically, and we were trying to find how we can work together and help through even if at the margin, but every bit will help. So these are the kind of thing I worry. I don't have a clear picture yet, but we know the direction in net. There will be pluses and minuses. For example, this work for home, I know that in some countries, it was a huge enabler for the digitalization of the economy.
Yes.
It was a great enabler of women employment, for example. We have some cases in MENA, where you were, that in the region you know where women can work at home, was very liberating in some sense.
Yes.
For example, translation work of the legal document or some stuff like that. So the net impact, I don't know, and it may take years
Yes.
to
Well, I guess
settle.
just something to watch for and be aware of. Yeah.
We are, and this is a big
Yes,
part
as you say.
of our mandate, like the climate finance, by the way. And so up to December, we were at 40% of our investment were climate friendly. So that's a record. We're 15% only 5 years ago. So we ramped up, and it's not only us ramping up. Is I think the demand for green and climate conscious investment is picking up, was picking up, and I hope that we will not lose track of that. And maybe we're already thinking about the reconstruction, how we can make it more green. And there's a lot of cool ideas, but we need to see what will stick, not stick, and we'll have some announcement in the next few weeks, because we want to reconstruct more green if we can, because it makes a lot of sense. So that may be a segue to your question on what I call the phase two. Because frankly, I mean, again, to stylize the discussion, you have the kind of V-curve type crisis, so big destruction of jobs, business, and then a big bounce back, fine. You have the U shape, but and that is how long is the U? Is that a U like this or a U like that? And I saw someone that was talking about the bathtub, so it's a very long U, or the
Yes,
L shape.
although I have to say, sorry to interrupt, but my is that it could be a V, it could be a U, it could be a bathtub, but I think the question is, when it comes out, does it
Yeah,
come back to the same level, or does it
correct.
actually come out to a lower level? So I think we have to also make sure that whatever the shape of getting there, where we get to is at least where we were to start with, and it's not obvious to me that in many ways we are going to be there.
No, it's not. It's not obvious to me either. But we know that we can do things that will. That's why the phase one, phase two are linked in my mind. So we know things that will happen in phase two, and we're getting ready for that. Is cleaning up the DPLs of the bank. There's many ways you can do the wrong thing or the good things, but you need to clean the DPLs, because otherwise the response will be muted. That's just one little aspect. Then you were talking de facto, for example, you are using the airline industry, mergers and acquisitions and restructuring. We're stepping up to the advice, and they will come with more equity. We know that a lot of the debt will be transformed into equity. That has implications. So we're trying to get ready to that. And then, frankly, I don't know if I'm right, and I cannot demonstrate what I'm going to say, Masood, but my intuition is that we see foreign direct investment, and we see it directly through, not in aggregate, we see it in our own books and pipeline, going down. Is it minus 40%? UNCTAD is predicting. Is it more than that, less than that? I don't know, but it's going down. Now, how fast do you believe, and I don't want to kind of turn the table on you, but that FDI will recover quickly? I don't think so. I think it will take some time before we get to the level that were already stagnant of the last few years. Why? Because a lot of the company will have to lick their wounds and repair their own balance sheet before going to expansion. Except if we are able to deliver on what I've been pushing in IFC, as you know, to do what I call the upstream work. In other words, if you're a company, you have taken a hit in many different ways. You're still around, but you have taken a hit. Your balance sheet has been weakened. Now, you're not going to think about new bright investments. You're going to try to consolidate as much as you can and repair your balance sheet. Now, and this is not the time for you to spend 1 million in feasibility studies for a new plant or new. However, if we come and say, well, you don't have to spend the feasibility study. Here's a great opportunity. Here's the feasibility study, and we can de-risk your blended question. We can de-risk this investment. That may, everything else being equal, lead you to a more favorable look at it than starting yourself. So that's the whole thing on the upstream and that is a 2-3 years, but we have to start now. So that's what we're trying to push also. So it's consolidation, M&A, consolidation, restructuring of the balance sheet, but also trying to, it's not counter-cyclical, but it's kind of proactively accelerating the recovery if we can by proposing good bankable projects. So that is one thing. Another, I was doing it before the crisis because mostly because we saw not enough bankable project in Africa. We need to do it even more today. So that's a big effort that we're doing right now to recruit. It's a paradox, but we're recruiting 200 new staff from outside to do exactly that. And that is something that all DFI will need to have, because the market today is, the demand is increasing, but it's a very different demand. It's short-term capital. Now, tomorrow, our bread and butter is long-term finance and investment finance. So here, I think that this creating bankable projects will become even more important in the next 2-3 years than it was before the crisis. So that's my 2 cents.
That I personally, I've been a long time supporter of this basic trend of that, we try to have seen to, which is essentially to move it upstream, because that is where the bottleneck is, and if anything, we're going to find on both sides of the equation it's going to get harder. On the one side, there's a strange world we live in for a few years now, where the risk-free interest rate is going to be 0, and where the risk premium is going to be at an all-time high for developing countries. So you see the spread is going to be going up and staying up for a while. It's my personal guess is that it's going to stay up. And in that market, to try and attract private firms to overcome their risk aversion and go in with private capital will be harder to do. On the other side, the prospects for countries post-crisis will not be, as I was saying, we're not quickly going to come back up to the same trajectory and then take off from there. This is not just a pause. This is actually going to probably have a longer-term shadow in terms of prospects. And so making that market work, which in a way is the role of DFIs, is going to take you much more from the transaction level to the upstream, creating the framework and the markets and generating the supply of bankable projects, particularly in the lower income countries, which are going to be the ones that are going to be the hardest to do. So I think, if anything, if you were on that path before, frankly, in my view, there is no other path anymore,
No, I think that you're spot on. At least I completely agree. That's why, in the middle of a crisis, we're recruiting. We have a very strong recruitment drive right now to recruit people that are a bit different from those of the structuring, the finance of an investment, which we do and we know how to do. And so we're recruiting a lot on the upstream, which is a different type of skills, because it was needed before, it will be even more needed and even more difficult tomorrow. I completely agree with you. And then one point that you raised that I didn't touch upon, but I think it's a very, very important one, is the blended, the role of blended. When I introduced the private sector window in IFC at the beginning of IDA 18, 3 years ago, there was a lot of pushback. So, well, aren't you crossing some taboo here, some red line, and muddying the water? And my response was that, listen, I'm a pragmatist. If I see it's all, the question is risk return. So we can work on the returns, but if the risk is very high, it's very simple. Things are not happening where they need to happen. Or you go completely public, but we tried that and it didn't work very well. So let's try to play on the equation on both the risk, reducing the risk to reduce the return to make a project bankable. If you need the IRR of 30% to cover your risk, I mean, nothing happens de facto. So that's the heart of the blended. Right. And I know there's a lot of excitement around this notion, and the purists are not very happy, but I think this is the only way. And what is the way to frame it is, what is the alternative? What is the alternative? 2-3% private investment in the poor countries. That's what we want, where the job creation need is immense. Well, what is the alternative? Because it's all very nice to always criticize. The problem is you criticize, but to what objective? What do you want? We know today in Africa, the need for infrastructure is about 47 billion a year. Now, there is no, and that was before the crisis. There is no way on earth that there are public, and the public finance plus all the MDBs and everybody does about what, 9 from memory, only a fraction. So every year you accumulate a gap of infrastructure. What's the way out? What is the way out? What is the way out? So crowding private finance, but that means a lot of change in policy, and that means de-risking, because if you wait for having all the policies and the utilities being nicely working and having no financial issues, we can wait a long time.
Exactly. But I think that takes you right back, in my view, to the point that you're making, that the blended finance is one of the tools in your toolkit. Yeah. And you have, I mean, I actually personally believe that I think, in some places it's actually the tool that helps to bridge the gap, but it can't substitute for the kind of upstream work, because without that, you can keep blending and blending and blending. And at the end of the day, you still are going to find the separation. It's going to be very hard without doing the things that you're trying to do. So
I can explain what you say in one project to make it concrete for the people that listen. And as you know, we have a drive to increase clean energy, and in particular solar in Africa. So what does it mean? So you have to have independent power producers, so that you minimize the public outlay. But in some countries, some of the big companies that could do a very good job to do very quickly a solar plant, IPP, independent power producer, were not interested because the risk is just too high. And just the cost of doing the feasibility study is not worth the effort. So what we did is we worked to upstream with the government. We find a piece of land, which is not that easy and can take a lot of time, which a private investor may want to do that for a huge market, but not for a small market. So we did that. We put all the legal documents. We worked with the World Bank to have a PRG, a policy guarantee, which was doing what? Ensure that the utilities that were not in good financial shape will pay the electricity. Because if you want to invest in a solar plant, the first thing you ask is, fine, I take the risk of construction and management, but if you don't pay me the electricity, I'm basically bankrupt. So guaranteeing these kind of the purchasing power agreement is critical. And then we auction, and we got first-rate companies to invest because it was de-risked. And they invested, and we produce now electricity at 4.5 US cents a kilowatt hour in a country where, frankly, the average today is 21 cents a kilowatt hour.
Yes, exactly.
So that is where you use both the blended De facto, it's a blended. You have a public guarantee by the World Bank in that case. You do the feasibility study upstream, and you crowd in investor that will never have set foot in that particular country. I can assure you.
Hopefully, exactly in that kind of operation, in fact, is a guarantee that should never be called, because at 4.5 cents, that is the kind of power that any government will want to have, as opposed to the legacy plants that they're saddled with, where they're probably paying, as you say, at the margin 20 cents. So, absolutely.
But that operation will never have happened without the work upstream and without the de-risking and de facto one form of the blender. That's one form of the blender.
Yes.
So that's the kind of return that we can work on.
Philippe, I know you have many, many things to do today, and we're going to run out of your time. But I do want to say one thing in ending, which is that I think in a few months' time, as we transition from phase 1 to phase 2, it would be useful to get together and start talking about some of the challenges that I think all DFIs will face in phase 2, in terms of what are we trying to rebuild, and how can we rebuild it to be the kind of economies and structures that we think are built for tomorrow, rather than simply recreating yesterday. So I think I look forward to that if you're open to that conversation. But today I want to thank you very much for your time. It's always a real pleasure to talk to you and to learn from you. So thanks again, and we look forward to continuing this conversation.
Likewise, and I noted, I didn't respond to that, but I noted the hint on putting the thing on our website. But we wrote to every client, but I think putting on the website is also good for the external world. So we wanted to target our existing clients, so we did that. They all know, but we will put that on the website for the rest of the world to see, even if by definition, by reading it, they will see that they're excluded because it's existing client.
It's a good idea. Great. All right, good.
So thank you. And always a pleasure to talk to you. And let's take this virtual appointment in a few months. Thank you.
Thank you.